The MG-ZS has a pretty conventional braking setup with a single piston caliper on a vented disc at the front and the same but on a solid disc at the rear. Although these 180s have larger discs than the 4-cylinder cars, the system layout is the same on all of them, and one other thing they all share is that the handbrakes are rubbish. The handbrake is on the rear caliper, pretty standard design, with a cable actuating an internal cam. So let's give the handbrake lever a pull. There we are, handbrake on. Now let's release it again. Wonderful. It's seized. You can see the handbrake lever now has very little resistance to it. Now, this could be an issue with the cable, but if we go back to the caliper, it's clearly the caliper itself that's at fault, so we're going to need to replace it. First off, we need to back off any adjustment in the cable system, remove the rear ashtray assembly, and this gives access to the adjuster. You can see the large difference in cable position due to the right caliper mechanism not returning properly. Just use a socket to wind the adjuster back to put some slack in the system. Here's the replacement caliper. While you can get a kit and rebuild the caliper, I can't be bothered, and it's cheap enough to just put a new one on. All you have to be aware of is that the calipers are left and right handed, so make sure you buy the correct one. Well, that's the new caliper, let's get the old one off. This starts with using a screwdriver to keep the link pin in position, then pulling out the R-clip with some needle nose pliers. After that, the pin can be removed. With the cable now free from the caliper mechanism, it needs to be detached from the body of the caliper. To do this, there's a thin metal clip that needs to be slid off, but these things are often a bit rusted in place, so something wide like a chisel is a good way to flick it up far enough to be able to remove it with some pliers. Then, although it may need a bit of wriggling, the cable itself needs to be fed back through the hole in the bracket on the caliper. Once it's out, you can tuck it out of the way for now. Bolts next. There isn't quite enough room to get a socket on the lower one with the hose still attached, so instead I'll be using a crow's foot wrench on a breaker bar to crack it off, followed by a ratcheting spanner. Then it just unscrews by hand. The top bolt has some more room around it, so I can use a socket there, and that gets cracked loose and unscrewed. Incidentally, the pins these bolts screw into can usually rotate and need to be held with a spanner, but this design is quite good, and they have flats on them that brace against the caliper, so you don't need to do that. With the bolts out, the caliper just pulls off and is hung out the way. You may need a bit of brute force here, but I'd not long put new discs and pads on the car, so mine was easy to remove. Note this pin protruding from the pad. This is significant as this groove in the caliper slides past it as the caliper goes on, so make sure this groove is aligned to slide on nicely as the caliper is refitted. The pad spring goes into the caliper itself, clipping into the cutout in the casting. The new caliper slides on and the bolts can be refitted. Next, it's the handbrake cable through the hole in the bracket. And the securing clip goes back on. The cable end attaches to the handbrake mechanism, and the pin pushes through with the R-clip securing it in place. Last thing to be transferred is the brake hose. By using some hose clamp pliers and moving it across quickly, the amount of fluid loss can be minimised, and this will make bleeding easier afterwards. The bolt is removed from the banjo fitting, and although the bolt can be reused, these copper washers need to be replaced. New washers on, the hose can be attached to the caliper. With the hose pliers removed, the last job is to bleed the brakes. I'm using my pneumatic vacuum bleeder, so with that attached, it sucks through the fluid to get rid of any air we've introduced into the system. Once the new caliper is bled, I went around the car and rebled the rest of the system, but hadn't introduced enough air for it to make any difference. Now, you generally don't want to be touching or adjusting the handbrake quite yet on most systems like this. Instead, what you usually need to do is use the foot brake a bit to take up any slack, and then make the adjustment. The way the Haynes manual says to do this is to pull the handle to the first click, then tighten the adjuster until you just get some brake drag, at which point you should have about 7 to 11 clicks of handbrake travel in total. That got my handbrake up to the point of just passing the MOT, which I can live with as being about normal for one of these cars, and so another job is off the list. So, if you want to see what I did next, subscribe to the channel, and I'll return again soon with another video. Right, so a little bit of a bonus here if you're interested in how your rear caliper works. Inside the bore here, you've got this central rod, which has a thread cut on it, and then your piston has a similar threaded tube on the inside, and that's held in with a circlip, which I've undone on this. You can see how that's got a square section that fits into the end there, so it can drive it. That's all held together like that. So hydraulically, it just works on normal hydraulics. You've got a normal bore with a seal around here, but for the handbrake, it's that thread. And the way it works is, there's your cam. I've got a pair of mole grips on it, so that rod goes down to the cam, and normally you have a cable coming across here to actuate it on an arm. So if we move that, it pushes that rod up. Okay, so that is what's actually actuating the handbrake. Well, this should show you why these things are so prone to seizing. So this is the part which turns inside the end of the caliper like that, and you can see here it's got this pin. So what it does is it pushes this pin. As you turn it, that pin gets pushed out. The pin is what pushes the back of this, so that pushes forward. That has this seated into it, which pushes that way, and it's onto that, which this is screwed. So that's your adjustment, and that's pushing there, and that is pushing onto your caliper like that. So that's what actually pushes out and causes your brake to apply. But of course, all this stuff is floating around in brake fluid, and to be perfectly honest, it tends to be okay. This stuff tends not to be that bad. If you're going to get something seizing on this side, it's most likely to be your seals will go, and you'll get your caliper piston seized to the wall of the bore. But these internal mechanisms tend not to be too bad. It's this bit here, and you can see this one's really badly clagged up, because this one on this side of the seal is all rusty, and that is what makes it stick, because there isn't enough pushback to overcome the resistance where it's all corroded together. So if I was going to rebuild it, it'd be these components here which need a good going over. And to be fair, if I clean these up, put it all back together, it'd probably be working again and would stay working for some time. But a new caliper is so cheap, it's easier just to replace the entire assembly. So this little lot and all the ancillary bits we've got here will be going in the bin.